The Misfits.
Hello everyone, my name is Tiara. I am a pastor's kid, so I grew up in the church, but I think most people will know me to be actively a Christian, actively professing my faith because of that. But my journey with Christ actually began even before my parents stepped into ministry. When I was a young girl, around 8 or 9, I remember going to church to visit, and at that time my parents were going through a divorce, and me being the little kid that I was, believed the pastor when he suggested that we could pray and ask the Lord for things and that the Lord would answer. And so I remember praying and asking that the Lord would keep my family together. And through some twists and turns, I think it ended up being like at least a year later, my family did come together. It so happened that my parents were also actively pursuing a relationship with Christ on their own, and I was still praying and asking God about it, and eventually he brought us all together. And so from that moment forward, we had agreed, myself included, that we would dedicate our lives to serving Christ, because the family that we were now, the people that we were now, was a result of his grace and his love and his mercy. And so from that day forward, I have been committed to learning and growing in Christ. And I have been on this wonderful journey of seeing who he is, of seeing him as provider, as seeing him as a teacher, as seeing him as a friend and a comfort. From traveling throughout Asia to going into an undergrad and now pursuing a PhD, I have gotten to see God work in my personal life by continuing to answer prayers, but also being a constant companion, someone that provides me with guidance, that directs me, and that reminds me that I am truly unconditionally loved, and what that means to value and cherish myself. But it all began with that one prayer as a little girl who just blindly was believing, okay, let's see what God can do. And so today still, I am actively pursuing and seeing what God can do in my life, but also in the lives of others around me.
Hey everybody, welcome back. We are still in season 4. I still have no idea what episode we're on, but that's okay because we're still here. And today we are joined by a somewhat new face. Some of you may recognize her. If you are familiar with if you guys follow the Buddy Walk or are part of the Buddy Walk community, you heard me and her talk before. If you follow any of the stuff we do on Kingdom on the Road or with Let It Rip or any of the other network stuff, you've seen her, you've heard her, you see her dad all the time with me as well every week. But today we are joined by Tiara Wilson. She is a PhD candidate out at USC. She just got done with classes and now she's ready to just straight up let it all out on air with me, because we have a bit of a doozy of a topic, one that has been requested. I have seen it requested of people to explain it. Specifically, they wanted a white person to explain how this actually works because they didn't think that a white person would do it. But it's much more helpful to have a voice of color talking about it as well, and especially as educated of a voice of color as we have with Tiara. We are going to actually answer the question of what the difference is between white supremacy and racism, theologically, socially, within an ecclesiological setting, all of these different things. We're going to break it down today, so buckle up because this one could get it's going to get heavy, and it's probably going to get heavy very fast. So, Tiara, first of all, welcome, and let's set the table a bit. Tell everybody why you're the one that I chose to have this discussion. What's your background here?
So I'm assuming that you chose to have this discussion with me, because I have become kind of the social justice spokesperson in our little network. But that is because of my fields of expertise in research. I am an expert in sound and media studies as far as research goes, but also critical Black studies. So that means that I'm well versed in things like critical race theory or cultural studies, which is all about analyzing the ideologies and the social structures that influence our society. And then, aside from my PhD hat, I also wear a pastor's kid hat. So I'm also well versed in the scriptures. So if there's anyone that's willing to go in and actually dive in and tackle, okay, well, what does this look like as far as scholarship? And what does this look like as far as theology? I'm your gal.
Yes. So that's some of you should be familiar with kind of where we're coming at this from, because if you listen to the end of season 3, when I was talking with Dr. Hudson and Joel Bowman, the idea of where Tiara sits within the world is very much what we were talking about. She is an expert within a very social education setting, but she also is coming from a heavy theological, biblically based, prayer filled. I mean, if you're one that skips through the testimonies at the beginning, go back and listen to hers, because you'll hear exactly why we are doing this. Every part of her faith journey has been super prayer filled and heavily discipled and everything else. This is the culmination of two extreme worldviews coming together and forming into a renewed mind. That is the ultimate goal. It just looks like a PhD candidate out of USC. Now, the other thing you also have heard, if you go back to the end of season 3, is the fact that within white evangelicalism, or even American Christianity as a brand, that white supremacy is at the core of all of it. And that is the first thing we need to actually explore and define and parse out, because the argument we hear against that is the typical, well, I'm not a racist, I don't hate anybody. That's not what we are actually talking about. So, Tiara, let's start with, can you actually give us a somewhat of a definition for white supremacy first?
Yeah, of course. So the kind of general understanding of white supremacy is essentially that white supremacy is the presumed superiority of whiteness, which that equates also to white people, particularly in service to the domination of non-white people. So white supremacy is a social process. It is a logic. It is a structure of domination. So it's not just a kind of, oh, I personally hate all non-white people kind of thing. It is actually a structure that organizes our society. And it is grounded in material extraction. So it's about like actually being able to extract wealth and profit off of the resources at the expense of non-white people, but it's also based off of we identify 3 specific anchors of white supremacy. One is slavability or anti-Black racism, which we're going to talk about a bit, right? It's like, is this the defining feature of racism or of white supremacy, or are there others? But there's 3. So there's slavability, anti-Black racism. There's also genocide, which is about the extermination of people, which deals explicitly with like settler colonialism and erasures of indigeneity. And then the last one is Orientalism, which is specifically dealing with war, right? So the way that Euro-American societies will justify wars often by targeting the perceived non-white threat. So Orientalism, usually we think of the East or the Middle East, but it can be a logic that is not exclusive to Asia or the Middle East. But so those are the 3 anchors of white supremacy. But writ large, white supremacy is based on this idea of kind of presumed superiority of whiteness.
And so there's a couple of a couple of words we need to pull out. The first one, though, I think that actually would be helpful because this is a word that gets thrown around a lot, especially currently right now within the Israeli-Palestinian debates, is when we talk about the word genocide. Would you agree that within the definitions that we're using here, because again, a lot of the definition, if you're listening to this going, wow, these are really big words, that's because a lot of this is social theory and sociology and things like that. So this is an academic field. That one of the things that also would play into the genocide of a people wouldn't necessarily be in the actual ending of life, but the ending of a way of life. Would that also fall into the genocide camp as far as like with things like assimilation, things like, even the Crown Law trying to be denied or passed within the U.S. right now, things like that? Would that also be something that would fall more into the genocide camp in terms of it's a elimination of a thought process and a culture? Or would that more so be just in the supremacy side of the domination of others?
So typically for the genocide, we do I think it's important to center indigenous stories. So like actually native people, or what we would call First Nation peoples, the communities, the cultures that were here before European settlers came here. And so I think that, yes, there is a certain extent where you can include incorporation, or as you said, assimilation as one of the technologies of genocide, right? Because it is a way of like eliminating that culture. It is a way of erasing that people. But it is never on its own. So it's always coupled with also violent extermination, right? And so when we say that, that could be something as explicit as actually going to like warfare and using combat to annihilate people, or it could be disease. It could be what we call slow violence, right? Which is the pervasive exclusion of people, like people not getting access to resources they need. So over time, they get sicker, they get poorer, right? And so they end up starving, they end up unwell, right? So there's all of these different layers to that genocide. So there is assimilation, there is slow violence, there is explicit combat, and all of that goes into it, right? I think people tend to just focus on one or the other, but it's a big picture type of thing. And I think the other thing is it's important to recognize it's an ongoing process. I think a lot of times people will say that, oh, it happened in the past, it's not happening now. But even outside of the current kind of Israeli-Palestine discourse or conflict, right, we can see that it's happening there explicitly, but it also continues to happen here, right? That there are still Native Americans here that are continuously being erased or forgotten, right? And so I think that, yeah, genocide is an important part of white supremacy that people erase because they focus on it as like, oh, that has nothing to do with whiteness, right? But it has everything to do with the logic of white supremacy.
Or they blame it on wanting to preserve their own thing rather than claiming that it's erasing something else, which is part of where we get into the other words that we used from the first tenet that are more so of where the theological discussion is going to start actually coming out. Is the two words you used. The first one you used was, now I just lost what it was. Starts with a P.
As far as for the white supremacy, I know there's anti-Black racism and slavability were the first kind of two parts. Yeah. Yeah,
no, it was a word that you used with it. The second word that I remember right off the top of my head, so we'll just start there and then maybe the other word will come to me. Oh, the first word that you used, there it is. The first word that you used was promotion. As far as is the promoting of whiteness. But then you said explicitly to the domination. Or the word that I use most of the time in these sort of discussions would be detriment, because detriment has fewer letters, which is why I end up using it, of others. Those are the words that I want us to sit with for a minute, because this is part of the problem that we have before we even get to just the church at large. This is primarily the problem that we have within the Christian nationalism discussions. is that nationalism in itself, the definition for nationalism is the promotion of one ethnicity to the detriment of others. Yeah. That right there is part of why we always are going to tie white supremacy to Christian nationalism. You cannot have nationalism without some sort of ethnic supremacy. And within the United States, or within Protestantism as a whole, you can't have a supremacy of an ethnic people without it being by default white theology. So go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say that, that tends to be the case, right? Like one of those things that just like with capitalism, it's always racial capitalism, even though people forget the racial part, or they intentionally erase the racial part. The same thing is said with nationalism. It's almost always ethno-nationalism, right? But because we forget to engage with nations as like actual ethnic communities, because whether in the case of the United States, right, it's because of the presumed kind of multicultural image of America, right? We kind of erase the ethno part, but it is ethno-nationalism, right? And the fact that like when you talk about making America great again, or you talk about who is an American, right? It invokes specific images, most of which are based on whiteness, right? They're able-bodied, they're heterosexual, they are white men, right? And so all of those go together too, as a part of also the logics of white supremacy. It's not even just about race. It's also about the promotion of Eurocentric values as the right way to do things as well, right? And that's where we get into also issues of like heteronormativity, as well as like what a lot of people would dismiss as cultural issues, right? Like, oh, we just have the more civilized way of doing it, right? Like this kind of idea. And that comes out in the church all of the time, right? With these questions of like, is there a right way to worship, right? Is there a right way to be a Christian? And the answer is always for them, yes. And this is what it looks like, right?
Well, and even, I would also add that it's not to the list of the people that you said were at the top. One of the things that's come out recently, again, is even the idea of it's white able-bodied men. Because, again, we just saw this week of another well-known pastor making comments about mental health not being real. So there are a lot of moving pieces there, and we're going to probably get to most of them at some point in this discussion. But part of what we have to get through as to why this is actually a theological discussion, and that's why it needs to continue to be talked about, is with the other word that was used, which was the idea of promotion of one specific thing, which is the list that we just gave. But what, I guess I want to hear your thoughts with it first before I jump into it. What is the difference between a promotion of one set of ideas compared to what would be considered like a actual like hatred of other ideas? Do you see a difference, or do you think that they are ultimately the same thing?
So I think that in common language, there is a difference, because when people hear the word hate, they automatically assume malevolent intentions, right? They're like, oh, you're actively trying to harm people, right? You have an intention to hurt people, right? Whereas if you talk about just like the promotion of one's own culture, or like the thinking that your culture is the best culture, right? They would see that as pride, right? And most people will say that, oh, cultural pride is a good thing. National pride is a good thing, right? So I think that in the common kind of conversation, those two are very different, right? As far as when people hear it, this is what I think of. But I think when we actually look at it from a systemic level, right, they actually end up overlapping in the sense that often the promotion of one's own culture or white culture as the supreme or the best option, right? The right answer, the normal answer, the civilized answer, all these different things. Like what it does is it ends up formatting the other as the opposite, right? And so when it does that, right, that it is actually effectively making it a bad thing, right? So if you come in and you say that, oh, well, we represent reason, we represent rationality, right? Then the other automatically becomes unrational, irrational, right? It becomes the thing that is like supernatural and spooky and doesn't make any sense, right? Like immediately there's already a contrast that's being made of, oh, we're this, so we're better, and they're not, right? And so I think that even if that contrast is not based explicitly on the desire to harm, right, it is already causing harm, which makes it harmful, right? Or we could say full of hate, right? And then I think that also it is, even if the desire is not to hurt that person, often a lot of times what we see with white supremacy from a systemic level, right, or structural level, is that there is a desire to elevate oneself, right, or one's group, right? In this case, it was like you're I think this is the best example to think of like how we think through colonization, right? Is like, why would Europeans just go to other countries and start extracting resources, right? It will, like, a lot of people will say, oh, well, it's not necessarily that they hated them, but they created this justification in order to get what they wanted, right? And so that also, right, is another example. When you presume that yours is the best culture, right, then you are kind of selfishly fixated on improving it and making sure that it can be sustained, even at the cost, or, like, to use your word, the detriment to other cultures. So it ends up being the same. So I think that, like, in a common conversation, yeah, we can get caught up in all of this. Well, I don't hate people and I don't do this, but, like, you are causing harm, right? There is a harm being done, whether you want to say that it's intentional or not, right? Does it really matter? I'm of the belief that no, intention doesn't overpower impact. So if the impact is
that ultimately,
oh, go ahead.
That ultimately is why we're having this conversation, is because that is the way that when we talk about a need for repentance from within American Christianity, for white supremacy, for racism, for the harming of others, the responses we get back are things like one of them is this idea of, well, there is no such thing as a systemic level, because that's just Marxism. The other comments we get, though, are things like, well, there may have been racists in the past, but I don't hate them. So it's not white supremacy. Because we look at white supremacy and we just see things like the KKK, the Proud Boys, things like that, and we ignore all these other levels of it, or the way that it has benefited specific groups of people within the country over the past 400 some years. And so part of what we are hoping to do with this is take it from that common language level, which is what she said as to why everybody says these things are completely different things, and actually boil it down to what is actually at the root of all of it. And I think the first place actually that we would need to start with is the word that you used as far as from a theology standpoint as to what the actual problem with the fact that we have a white supremacy problem, not just a generic racism problem within our theology, is the word pride. Now, that's a word that is politically charged at the moment, also on every single possible level you can think of. What do you say to people that will try to replace the word pride with patriotism?
I mean, patriotism and pride go hand in hand. I think pride typically is used in the case of like an individual, right? Like you can, on a personal level, right? You can have pride in your family, right? You can have pride in things that are very interpersonal, right? Like that are between you and I or your local community. Patriotism, though, is especially like patriotism and nationalism kind of go hand in hand in that way, of that they are both like explicitly about a pride in your nation, right? And so that being a driving force and a motivation behind like what people do. But I think that like as far as when we're thinking about pride, as far as like connecting it to white supremacy, right? I think the other thing that people often forget is that, right, white supremacy also, as I stated earlier, is about the kind of promotion of Eurocentric values as well. So I think a lot of things that come into the church that get erased as like a part of the white supremacy project in favor of like focusing on like Christian national, which is important, right? We do need to focus on and address, right, the way that is problematic. But I think is the other thing is that we make oftentimes assumptions about like what worship should look like something as or what our relationship to our neighbors should look like, right? These things that are simple,
or even who our neighbors are,
or who our neighbors are, right? Like, okay, the whole debate about like Black churches going for 10 hours versus white churches being like 45 minutes, right? And like civil versus uncivil, right? That is like often, or this idea of like the charismatic Black church versus the kind of reasonable, rational kind of relational worship of the general church, because they usually don't say white church, it's implied, right? Which is a whole nother part of like what we mean when we say that white supremacy is about normatizing whiteness as the standard, right? These are like things that are like a part of what we would consider white supremacy, but we don't often address it that way because we're not thinking of it as also like this pride in Eurocentric cultural values, right?
Yeah, let's stay there for a second, because part of what you said is that it's another discussion that has come up, and it's very interesting because people that know the work that Misfits does or is connected with it is shocked when we see the responses, even from some Black pastors that are unaware of who we are. The way that we use the terms church, American church, even in some cases evangelical church, Black church, all these different things, the comments that we get a lot of times is this idea of, well, you may think that that's what this is, but that's not actually what it is. That's not what I mean by it.
Mm-hmm.
How do you think we actually should go about having these kind of conversations? Because one of the things that we've talked about with both Dr. Hudson and Joel Bowman is the reality that even within American Christianity, within some of the historically Black denominations, we still have this same thing that you're talking about, as far as white Eurocentric values are still found at the core of what is going on within some of the Black churches. How should we actually go about addressing some of these things? Because the assumption is that if you use the wrong word, then that means you automatically fit into one of these camps, which means that now we are back to what we said before of now you're the other, you're the enemy, whatever it might be. How should we actually go about, because your dad and I have had this conversation off air, but I'm interested to hear from more of the sociology side of all of this. How should we actually go about talking about problems within a American cultural Christianity that encompasses more than just Protestantism, Catholicism, Black mainline, white mainline, even that encompasses an actual, culture of a people, much more than breaking down into individual beliefs or even ethnicities? How should we actually go about talking about this?
Yeah, so I think that that's a great question. I think there are a lot of ways to do it. I think one of the biggest thing is that practically we have to get less obsessed with categorization. I think that even that often is something that people don't realize is a legacy of, and we've talked about this on air before as well, a legacy of like kind of humanist movements and the Enlightenment thinking and the fixation on ration and reason is like you have to be able to categorize things, right?
Which again is a Eurocentric idea.
Exactly. You have to make things linear, right? Everything has to be in its proper space. So if you are a Baptist, you need to believe in baptism. And you need to look like this, right? You need to be from the South. You need to have this, right? All these kind of expectations are based on a presumed categorization. Same thing with, like, we can talk about general kind of Protestantism or Pentecostal churches, right? All of these assumptions are based on the idea that the universe is ordered and linear and we need to keep it that way. People need to stay in their boxes, right? And so one of the first things we can do is to begin to, like, problematize that, trouble those waters, right? Don't, like, look to something based on the label. Go beyond the surface. Actually ask questions. Like, I think that this is something that I personally had to do for myself moving out to California, because I had to find a new church, right? I couldn't just keep going online. I couldn't, I had to actually find a way to get connected. And so there were a lot of churches that people were like, oh, just dismissive of already. They were like, you don't want that church. It's not Black enough. Or you don't want that church. It's not multicultural enough. You study Asian stuff. You speak Korean. Maybe you should try a Korean church. Like, all of these different, like, kind of ways of thinking through churches via their labels, instead of, like, encouraging me to actually just go and see what the church is about. And I think that often is the case, right? People will do that instead of relying on conversations with, or, like, seeing what a person is about. And so I think that one of the biggest things is that, like, especially in the age of digital technology, right? I think it's really important to actually take the time to, like, read through, right? People are saying they stand for on their websites, on social medias, but also actually in person, go get a feel of the culture, right? And when you do, think of it not as this is not what I thought a Baptist church should look like, or this is not what I thought a Kojic church should look like, right? But think of it as, like, is this biblically sound? Can I fit into this culture? Like, can I actually subscribe to these values, right? And, like, instead of getting fixated on the boxes, right? I think that that's a really important thing. But I also think that it's also really important to not overlook that church attendance and participating in church has become really political today, right? Yes. And so even like the quote unquote, like, protection of Black churches, right, as their own separate spaces is a political act, right? The desire to find a Black church, or a church that is whatever culture you identify with, right? Like, non-white culture, because, like, Korean churches are big out here, right? There's also, like, Chinese churches, things like that, right? All of this is a response to, right, the exclusion that these people are normally feeling in their everyday life. And so it's a tool for survival, right? To create a kind of counterculture. So I think that's also a conversation that has to happen, is, like, how do we actually protect these spaces as safe spaces, but still not, like, think of them as without fault? Because I do agree with you that, like, even, like, in Black Christian churches, right, it's often a promotion of Black capitalism. It's often a promotion of, like, heteropatriarchal families, like the nuclear family, all this other stuff, right, that we associate with Eurocentric values. And that's a part of a larger issue of, like, Black American is very much still American, right? But, like, I think the emphasis on the Blackness often becomes a strategy. We call it, to use the academic lingo, strategic essentialism, right? A way of intentionally promoting, like, Blackness as the definer, so that you can create a community, right? So putting everything else on the hold, so that becomes the priority of our identity. And so I feel like even in creating those safe spaces, we have to actually do the work of making them a safe space to even have difficult conversations about, well, why do we do offering the way that we do offering? Why are we preaching on these specific topics, right? Why are we in this neighborhood when most of the Black people in our community are actually down the block in downtown? You know what I mean? Those kinds of questions.
And that's the kind of stuff that I think it was Ray Park, Pastor Ray Park, that was talking about this. it's been, I can't even remember. There's been too many, unfortunately. No, after there was the shooting at one of the Korean churches, I think in California, actually. There were people that were commenting on him about the whole thing of, well, why are you okay with the Korean church, but then you have a problem with just straight up white churches? One of the things that he pointed out, and this is one of the things that part of how we're going to get into a lot of these other things going on as well, is that part of the reason for gathering together in those sort of settings is just for the ability to be able to worship in one's own language.
Right.
There's a difference between a desire to worship in your native tongue and a desire to just worship with people that look, act, and think like you.
Mm-hmm.
That's a big piece that is missed in these sort of conversations. The other thing that I always point out is that whenever I have walked into a historically black church, a historically Asian church, a non-white church, Latino church, whatever,
Mm-hmm.
I'm immediately welcomed. Somebody's asking me to sit with them. They're loading our plates up with food before we leave, even though we didn't even know it was potluck Sunday. They're asking us to go out. It is you worship the same God I do. Come, let us worship together.
Right. It's a community thing.
You don't get that same sort of thing normally. And I'm saying it in a very, again, we're talking a cultural setting here. You typically don't find that within historically all white churches.
Mm-hmm.
If you do find that, they probably would not even call themselves a white church. They would probably just call themselves a church.
Mm-hmm.
This is part of the thing that we're starting into when we get to the theological level, as far as why, in many ways, we need to start identifying that churches may not necessarily be quote unquote racist, but there's definitely an air of white supremacy within it. Mm-hmm. Is that it's not necessarily about a active hatred. It is much more of in a theological sense, it is much more an idolatry of self and those that look like us.
Yeah.
Would you agree with that, or do you think that we're missing pieces still?
I mean, I think that when you do frame it as like an idolatry of self, right, there is the possibility of erasing the systemic part. So I do think it needs to always be in conversation, right? Because that's something that we run into with when we focus too much on white privilege versus white supremacy, right? When you focus on white privilege, it becomes about, how are you as an individual benefiting from this? How are you as an individual profiting from and investing in whiteness, right? Versus seeing the systems as also responsible, right? As seeing institutions as also responsible. So I think that it's a fine balance, yes. And so for the church, it's always a multi-level.
And that balance is what I was going to say. That balance is exactly what I wanted us to spend the rest of the time finding, because part of what I have found, at least within the past 10, 15 years, dealing with churches as just a churchgoer, as somebody studying theology, as a pastor, as a outsider looking in on the church in some cases, all these different things, is that the balance we should be able to find the balance between recognizing the system that built this and that upholds it as a part of why this idol will not be smashed. And so I think first, though, I do want you, since you're on here, to also explain this, because you just used another term that I've used before, and people say this all the time but can never define it. You're going to be able to actually define it. define out white privilege for us, because this again is going to be part of what the idol is that needs to be smashed that people can't ever seem to recognize.
Yeah, so white privilege is about the social experience of being white, right? It is about the way that you are able to benefit from or interact with those around you, including people, including institutions like education, law enforcement, etc. And the way that you are able to move through those spaces relatively safely, relatively efficiently, relatively without like challenge or contestation because of your identification with whiteness, right? So it's specifically about seeing, I think one of the best metaphors that I've seen for discussing white privilege, right, is essentially about mobility, like the ability to move. So think about like if you have a passport, right, you are now able to travel internationally, right? Without that passport, you cannot do that, right? At least legally, right? And whiteness kind of functions like a passport, right? It is a way for you to travel with ease through different institutions, through different social opportunities, right? In a way that is often overlooked by individuals who have it, right? And that is what we refer to as like white privilege, is this idea that you can move through life, right? Often unaware, right? I think I will never forget, James Baldwin wrote it. He said that the white man and the black man live in two completely different worlds, even as they occupy the same space, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so it is because you experience, due to that, the stamp of whiteness on your skin, right? You experience a different way of living, right? Different opportunities. And yes, it can be complicated by things like, are you straight or not straight, right? By things like, are you poor or not poor, right? But at the end of the day, there is a privilege that allows you to be at least imagined as belonging, right? Belonging to the quote unquote superior cultural group, the superior race, right? That allows you to move through spaces with a presumed confidence, with a presumed kind of capability, with a humanness that is not challenged, right? And I think that's what people think, is that like, forget, is that as a non-white person, you are constantly having to prove that you are human, right? That you have the right to be here, that you have the right to the same access and opportunities, that you deserve to be looked at as an equal. But if you're white, if you belong to that group, right, whiteness grants you a presumed humanity. Like you already have it.
And that's where, again, we're getting into what we are talking about pride and the difference between just what people look at as straight racism and white supremacy, is that the part of the white privilege side of what we within what we even teach within our churches is, again, the stuff you already identified, is the fact that the idea that God's design for family just that, and then as many kids as you can possibly have. There's no space for nuance of what happens with when dad walks out, what happens when mom walks out, what happens when there's trouble with the law, what happens when there's a death, what happens when there's illness, what happens when there's legal trouble, all these different things. There's this idea of, within the capitalist Christianity side of it, it's the same sort of thing of this idea of, well, a good Christian has a good paying job. That's ignoring the reality of what happens when you live in an area where there are no jobs and no employers will even look. Part of what we have within the white privilege setting of a Eurocentric mindset within the way we teach our theology, because we won't, and this is the other side, everything we're saying, people will claim up and down, this isn't a theological fact we teach. But you teach all of your theology in a way that upholds these things as the facts. This is why Karen Terrazas gets so many mentions all the time for people claiming that her work talking about infertility within the church is ignoring God's design for humanity. It's not ignoring God's design for humanity. She is trying to remind the church that women without children, parents without children, or adults without children in general, are not going against God's design for humanity because they are image bearers themselves.
Right.
The privilege of being able to always be looked at as an image bearer is in the theology that we are teaching when we are claiming that only these things honor God and nothing else can.
Right.
Now, the bigger piece with all of it, because I used the word idolatry earlier, and you kind of liked it once you said we need to just balance it out, which is why you're here. Well, I'm going to talk to the pastor kid for a minute instead of the PhD candidate. How would you define idolatry? Let's start with that. How would you define idolatry?
Yeah, so it's funny that you would ask. Not too long ago, I actually just taught on this for the women's group because we were going through a series on the names of God, and I got the jealous God, right? And so you can't talk about the jealous God without defining what it is that means, right? And that is he's uncontested and without rivals. So when we talk about idolatry, those would be the things, the people, the ideas, right, that attempt to draw away your devotion, your time, your attention, your talents from their focus on God, right? So that means that it can refer to anything something as simple as like watching TV, right? If it begins to like take away from your personal relationship with God and what God has called you to do, then it becomes an idol. But it can also be more abstract things, like one that we talked about with the women specifically was like beauty, right? The pursuit of beauty, and right, this beauty is always in conversation with white supremacy, right? That we're talking about, right? So it also has specific guidelines of like being thin, of being a particular complexion, right? Of having like long hair, of a certain build, like these kinds of things, right? But you're pursuing that to gain a satisfaction, to gain a sense of intimacy, but you can't get it from that because idols, unlike our God, right, are not alive. And I think that's the other kind of definition of idolatry. Not only is it, right, withholding your devotion from God in favor of bestowing it on something else, but it is also like kind of committing to this toxic relationship of like pursuing this thing, even knowing that you won't actually get anything out of it, right? Because it can't speak back to you. It can't actually fulfill you the way that God can. So that is how I think of idolatry. Mm-hmm.
I like that last part, especially that you identified as far as, the difference between our God and the idols is the fact that our God can talk back to us. Mm-hmm. That he's able to provide all these sort of things, because I think that is a part that I don't think I've ever actually heard anybody articulate that before. Mm-hmm. And it really does kind of make this conversation even easier. So this may be shorter than I thought. In terms of what the issue is when we get into this idea of why we are saying white supremacy is an idol within American Christianity as a whole. Mm. When your theology is centered around Eurocentric ideals, when it is centered around this quote unquote picture perfect family unit, mm-hmm. when all of your life is incorporated into that, and making people look like that. When the things that we talked about before with the white privilege things start to happen, that's why the faith falls apart. Because there is no response from those sort of things other than you need to try harder to look like the rest of us.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
That's part of how we can identify the fact that this is an idol that is there. This is part of the irony of the fact that a lot of the anti-deconstruction movement is centered around upholding the white supremacist views that are within the church more than they are anything else. Mm-hmm. Is that the things that actually are causing people to leave the faith are things that the Bible does have answers for when we are allowed to actually read it without the white supremacist lens clouding our judgment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that just like, I like the way that you said it, as in the sense of like the pursuit of this, right? Because I think that oftentimes like the negative picture that people portray of God is him as this taskmaster, right? With all of these demands, with all of these things that you have to uphold in order for you to receive his love. When in reality, it's the idols that are like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the idols that are like, okay, you can have all of the riches, you can have all of this, but you just have to do X, Y, Z, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, right? Whereas God is like, I just want you to show up, right?
It's Satan in Matthew 4.
Right. It's like, I want you to show up.
Yeah, it's Satan in Matthew 4. If you do this, then you can eat.
Right.
If you do this, then everybody will know you're the Son of God and you won't have to do anything else. If you bow down and worship me, you don't have to go to the cross to get the kingdoms of the world. I'll just hand them over to you right now.
Mm-hmm. Right.
That always has been that's always been the temptation. The temptation back in the garden of you can be like God was just eat the apple instead of learning who God is. Instead of walking with him daily like you have been, here's the quick and easy route to get there.
Right. And the temptations are often things that I think that we forget, that they're things that look good to us, right? And bringing up the example of the garden, right? Eve saw, that word saw literally means that she perceived it to be in her own best interests, right? And I think that we do that as well with our idols, right? Is that, and this comes up in the case of white supremacy as well, is that, right? Like you see what people are able to obtain when they fit this mold, right? You see that they are able to obtain all of this privilege, right? Even if you don't identify it as privilege, but you see that they benefit from it, right? And so you're like, I want that too. So then you do the work of serving that master as well, right? Of participating in this too. And then policing everyone around you to also ensure, okay, you need to do this too if you want it. Prime example is the amount of churches that profess the whole kind of pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of mentality of like the myth of the meritocracy, right? Is that like, if you just work hard enough, right? And they translate that also not only into like actual advice for you to like climb up the socioeconomic ladder, but they translate it to spiritual works too, right? Like if you just work, if you pray every day, if you do XYZ every day, God will give you what it is that you're asking for. And you're like, is that what we see in scripture? Is like, is that actually what we see? That this is a formula, that if I do this exactly this way every day, all of the time, that God is going to respond the way that I want him to. He's a living God, right? Like he's right. And so I think that like that also is a part of it, right? And so I can see like how we would consider it to be a type of idolatry, because you are actively investing in it and you are actively pursuing it, right? For these benefits, the presumed benefits, right?
Well, and it's presume personal benefits is the big thing. And this is part of why we are able to clearly identify that it is not a Christian outlook on the world around us, or especially not how the church is supposed to be defined, because it is literally the opposite of what we see in Philippians 2. What Philippians 2 tells us to do is to look at other people as better, which takes pride and supremacy out the window. You can't have pride and supremacy about yourself if you are considering everybody else as better than you. It tells us to consider their interests ahead of our own, which means that it doesn't matter if it's to my detriment. If it benefits them, this is what I'm supposed to be doing. And Paul very clearly goes on to say that this is exactly what Christ has done for us. This is the model that Jesus has set forward. He did not consider equality with God as something to be grasped. He sheds it. He humbles himself, even humbles himself to dying for people that he considered to be better than himself. Even though those people were not better than him. This is God. This is a perfect being coming down and dying for a sinful people. The only person that can say I am better than you is Jesus, and yet he considered others better.
Yeah. I think also important too is like, even on the side of like thinking interpersonal relationships, which I feel like that's kind of what you're talking about here with the like thinking of it better and like recognizing the humanity of, right, that we are all image bearers. I think the other side of it too is like theologically speaking is that like, right, the word says that you cannot serve two masters, right?
Right.
You will love one and hate the other. And so I think the other kind of proposition I always make to people is that if it comes down to, if you see in the word of God, right, that it says to love, right, or that it says to treat, right, or to treat your neighbor, to love your neighbor, right, to treat your neighbor as yourself, right, and you are unable to do it because of this set of ideology, right, because of these kind of social expectations, right, if it comes to choosing between, right, investing in white supremacy, right, upholding these standards that society and yourself has set for you, and doing what God has said, if you can't 100% choose doing what God has said, then you do have to ask the question is like, am I participating in idolatry? Because why would this hinder me from hearing what God has to say, right? And I think that is something that comes up as well, is that it's not even necessarily always the like you said, it's not about the practicing of hate. You're not walking around hating other people, right? You're not walking around condemning other people, but you are valorizing specific lifestyles, right? And oftentimes to the detriment of your own personal walk with God, right? And so when you make those decisions, whether on like a church body level of like us deciding to prioritize specific political values or agendas, or on an interpersonal level, right, you are actively choosing to invest in white supremacy over, right, committing to walking out what it is that God has called us to do on this earth.
Yeah, you know, this was one of the things that I brought up in 2020. I think I may have brought it up even when you and I were over on Buddy Walk together, is that, you know, 2020 was a perfect place where we can see the difference in a systemic level at the church as far as, are we Philippians 2 or are we serving our own interests?
Yeah.
Is that in the midst of the Black Lives Matter protests, you have churches condemning people saying the idea that Black Lives Matter, while simultaneously trying to protest and seek legal action against the government for not allowing them to meet in their own buildings.
Mm.
You have the church saying that it is we are seeking out our interests of having our regular lives back over the interests of image bearers that are being killed.
Mm-hmm. Also, to like put the sociologist hat on back on, that also, right, can be considered an investment in white supremacy, right?
Exactly, that's what it is.
Right, I would throw another term at you. We have it. It's called necropolitics, right? And necropolitics, at its core, is this idea that is the idea that part of what makes a government sovereign, right, that makes it the final authority, is that it has the right to justify who gets to live and who gets to die, right? It also gets to justify like who has access to the use of violence and who does not, right? And so part of that means that whether, again, to use slow violence, right, whether through like brutal kind of the actually in-your-face violence that we are often seeing, like today, against students across the United States on campuses, right? That kind of in-your-face violence, or the slow violence, right, of like not putting in proper measures to protect, right, immunodeficient communities or like vulnerable communities, as in the case of like the pandemic, right? Both of those are examples of, right, what we would call necropolitics, is, right, deeming that certain bodies, certain communities are less valuable than others. So it's okay if we invest in their death, right? It's okay if we allow them to die, right?
And this
that
is where
is also a technique of white supremacy.
And it again is one of the places where we can. This is part of why we're saying that it is an idol. Is that, again, you can actively say, well, we aren't actively calling for people to be executed. We're just saying, is in the way that we hear people talk about Romans 13. Because the argument that we hear from a lot of people is that what we have in Romans 13 is that the government carries the sword, and so they can kill those that they desire, that they deem that needs to be killed. And so Christians, if we are supportive of the government, need to be okay with the death penalty. or okay with war or okay with police shootings until suddenly the target is on us. And then suddenly we need to have a problem with it. But first of all, before we even get to the rest of the conversation, everything I just said as far as the way that that's interpreted is wrong, just to make that clear before somebody tries to cut that into the statement of Misfits. But part of how I know that that is wrong, beyond just actually reading the passage in context, is when you talk to church leaders from other parts of the world that are actually in active persecution, that have experienced active persecution. When they read Romans 13, they read it completely different. Mm-hmm. Because the recognition that the government carries the sword is a reminder for Christians that the government can execute you.
Right.
And that God has given them the authority to do it. What it is not saying is that because the government can execute whoever they want, we need to just sit back and let it happen. Because what we actually see in Romans 13 is a call for the church to submit to the governing authorities, the ones that carry the sword and are coming after you with the sword. To your own detriment, you submit to them. But you recognize that you submit to them because God has given the authority, which means that when we see the government coming after other people, our job is to stand in between, not to ask the government to make sure that we stay behind them as they swing their sword randomly. That is what it looks like to live as the church in a society, because like we have been saying over and over and over, the church is not a part of the society that they live in. The church is exiled. We as believers are not Americans. We are exiles. We may have American citizenship. We care for the communities that we are in. We are involved and active in the communities we are in. But ultimately, if I have to decide between am I an American or am I a member of Christ's kingdom is the one that I claim. And so when we see the church actively teaching a theology that says it's okay for the government to kill other people as long as it's not us, we need to be able to make the statement very clearly that that is not biblical. That is following after an idol. Because our call as believers is to put others' interests first, not our own. And so if the church has to lose tax status in order for us to be able to serve our communities better, then that is actually what we should be calling for. If the church has to lose credibility by standing up when law enforcement kills an unarmed black man, that is what our call is supposed to be. Mm-hmm. Not going back and doubling down on already bad theology that is centered on Eurocentric values and not Christocentric.
Yeah. Yeah. So a couple of things came up to mind while you were just talking. I think the first thing is that, right, this idea of the sword, right? The government is the one that wields the sword, that controls the sword. I think that is something that I've been thinking about a lot recently. Right. Because along the lines of like the necropolitics, right, there's also, especially right now with all of the protests happening and politics and everything, there is an attention to the language of terrorism, right? Who is a terrorist? What is a terrorist? And the way that term is weaponized to demonize certain types of popular protest or to demonize civil disobedience. Right. And I think that that is an example of the way that like terrorism is selectively applied, is that it's based on, right, the fact that the government exercises its authority, right, by having the monopoly over force, right? They are the one that gets to decide what is considered justifiable violence, right? And so anyone who is deemed outside of their justifiable violence, right, their act of basically, and that would be any violence that upends their authority, right, that challenges their authority, is labeled as terrorist, right? regardless of whether they have the moral upper hand, regardless of whether they have the support of the people or what, right? It's because that is part of like what makes the government, right? And so I think that that is also something that comes up quite a bit in, right, what happens with the church often as well, is that they will also join in on the bandwagon of calling specific people terrorists and all of this stuff because of their tactics or because of what they're doing, but they don't realize that they're like also co-signing, not from a theoretical, like a theological perspective, but co-signing from a political perspective, the government. And then the other thing that I was thinking about while you were talking, because you mentioned the image of us going in between, right, the government and the people that they are kind of violently oppressing, right? I was thinking of, and I tried to look back because normally I have the actual poster. I made one on here that has the scripture, but I'm moving, so I took it down. So you'll have to forgive me. I don't remember where exactly it is. I think it's in Numbers, but there is a point where basically Moses and Aaron have been dealing with the Israelites, and they have a kind of mini coup that's led where like the Israelites are kind of like, oh, why do you get to be in charge, and right, all of this other stuff, right? And so they piss off God, is the TLDR, and God is like, you know what, forget it, I'm just gonna rain down and kill all these people in the camp. And Moses and Aaron are like, wait, we didn't mean for you to kill them. And so they grab the incense and they go out to try and make intercession, even as the Lord is like killing these people, right? And I think that to me is a picture of exactly what you're saying, right? Is if we think of the Lord in that as like a symbol of kind of like the government, right? Like God didn't also kill Moses and Aaron, right? He allowed them to intercede even as he was bringing order, right? Even as he was bringing law. And like, but Moses and Aaron also had the heart to see that even if the Israelites were wrong, right, or not wrong, right, it didn't matter, that they were more invested in the preservation of their lives, right, than anything else. And I think that for me is always stuck with me about like what intercession looks like, right? And also like what it is that we are supposed to do as, like you said, in between, right, of being of this in this world, but not of this world, right? And so I think that is a really powerful image to take away. And then the last thing that I thought of while you were talking is, because I feel like we always talk about like the Romans, the Philippians is good, but the one that I always think of when thinking about like white supremacy and this conversation of like dealing with like interpersonal relationships is James 2, right? Where he talks about the sin of partiality, right? And dealing with favoritism and prejudice and all of that as well. And so I think that is equally as important to bring into this conversation, right? Because it says it pretty explicitly, right? And I think that people don't actually address like unpack what it means to deal with prejudice and favoritism in the church, right? And how that prejudice and favoritism is often baggage that comes from social bias, right? Like it's things that we brought with us from the world that come into the church because we don't do the work to unpack them. We just go, oh, this is the way things are supposed to be. You're supposed to have a nuclear family. You're supposed to make this income. You're supposed to have a house. You're supposed to have a job, right? And all of these different things. And instead of saying, oh, wait, this actually might be a bias, right? Like, let's unpack this, because like there are people that don't live like this, but are also human and are also worthy and are also valuable. So maybe this is a bias. We just kind of keep perpetuating the same logic. And so James 2, I think, is the other one that is really important for thinking through that.
Well, and I would add 1 Corinthians 1, 10 and 11 to that also, because Paul deals with the Corinthians there in the same way, using a little bit different language than James. James is much more explicit about it than Paul is.
He was just like, look, I'm going to get it. So
James and I think, would vibe because he has no filter whatsoever, which is ironic because he's the one that talks about controlling the tongue. But the other side of it, as far as I think the reason why James and Corinthians don't get brought up in this discussion as much is exactly why I wanted you on in the first place, is that, again, we want to talk about this problem as a problem in the past and that the racism is gone.
Right.
And we ignore the reality of the supremacy at the root of all of it. And so the idea of favoritism is no longer the thing we want to talk about. The idea of wealth is not what we want to talk about anymore. The food value is not what we want to talk about anymore. The tribalism is not what we want to talk about anymore, because those things are just there. Those aren't a part of what we're dealing with anymore. Now we're just dealing with racists here and racists there, and ignoring the reality that at the root of a lot of the, at least theological application that we teach, is still invested in something that is not found in Scripture, but is found within a Eurocentric humanist philosophical work, not Scripture.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that I and a lot of my colleagues actively try to challenge, right? Is because we do tend to look at it, especially like even in like news and popular culture and all of these different things, right? There's a common assumption that like, oh, we don't need to deal with that anymore. It's done. It's dead, right? Like we already deal with it. But like when we actually look at it, right? When we actually look at the facts, look at the math, right? A lot of people would say that the damage that's been done post-emancipation, right, might be just as equally important, if not more severe, because it's still ongoing than what was done right there. And then I think that also part of it is in these discussions is people center the United States, right? And if you center the United States, the U.S. presents this image as a multicultural utopia, right? Of like, oh, look, we have a company that has a Black person, a white person, someone who identifies as non-binary, all of these other things, right? So we're good.
And they all somehow managed to be in the same meeting room for the picture for the website.
Right, exactly. So we present that image, right? And so I think that is a part of like why people don't interrogate it. They're like, I see it on TV all of the time. Like, what are you talking about? We're good. But like, if you actually look in the day-to-day, people live in silos, like you said. Like if everyone knows, and I've experienced it as like more acutely, I would say, being a newcomer coming to California, you learn quickly where all the Black people live versus where all the Koreans live, versus where all the Chinese live, right? Versus where all the Filipinos live. And you see quickly that, right, that these kinds of designations still exist, right? And they're both being like reworked, as in the sense of like people are trying to transform them into sites of power, right? And to empower communities, but they are also still endowed with the legacy and the ongoing violence of the histories that inform them. And so like when we talk about racism, when we talk about white supremacy, a lot of times what we emphasize is that it's not a historical phenomenon. When we talk about it, we are historicizing it, which is different. Historicizing refers to the active process of connecting it to the historical context that it is in and that it came from, right? But when you make something historical, you say, oh, it was happening in the past and that's it, we're done. And that's not true. I think like, especially when we talk about like settler colonialism, right? People a lot of times will say that, oh, we don't have to deal with that anymore. Like all of the Native Americans are just a part of us if they're even still here. Or look, I'm half Native American. Like all this kinds of rhetoric that seeks to kind of erase the fact that like indigenous struggles are still important today, right? Like people are still calling for the return of their land to this day, right? And yeah, I think that also comes up in the church because people can look at Scripture and they will say, oh, that was racist in Scripture, right? They'll say, oh, slavery in Scripture was bad, right? But when you ask them to say, okay, well, if it's condemned here, shouldn't it be condemned in our practice? They say, oh, well, it's not the same thing because of this myth of like, oh, the past and the present are disconnected, right? It's a timeline. And then once you close the door on the past stays there and the present stays here. And that's not true, right? Time is not linear. Right. History is not a linear process.
Well, and we see it. And again, this is something that we actually can see in Scripture, because the ironic thing is that people are telling you, well, slavery was bad in Scripture, but it's not the same now. Whereas the people I deal with are all saying, no, slavery was okay in Scripture. And then now it's different thing that Scripture doesn't address. both are using supposedly the same scriptures to justify a denial of the Imago Dei today. Which is part of why we have to, again, this gets back to why we're saying this is an idolatry thing, is that you are now telling me that you are reading the scriptures in a way that you think justifies you being able to say that some people are not made in the image of God. Whether in today's world or in the past, one of those two you are saying was not made in the image of God. There's no other way to look at it when you are looking at it from a Christocentric lens. But if you are looking at it from a lens that bases people based off of demographics and voting patterns or income levels or whatever, image of God is so far down the list that is no longer what you even recognize you are doing.
Yeah.
And that's why it continues and continues and continues, is that we have to recognize that it is not that we need to just eradicate racism from our churches. That's not going to actually fix the problem. We've got to eradicate the white supremacy within our theology and at the heart of how we even incorporate our churches before we can even try to deal with the personal interactions that we have with people on the street or people sitting next to us in the pew that we don't want sitting next to us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So
you have to take the time to invest. And like I said, and this kind of circles back to kind of that definition of white supremacy I gave, right? Is that there were the three pillars, not the one, right? Is that it is dealing with racism. It is dealing with like genocide. It is dealing with Orientalism, right? And so I think that as on the institutionalized as churches, we have to think about the ways that we are, whether or not we are investing in white supremacy by upholding those tenets, right? Like, and we have to, if we don't do the work to like actually sit down and say, okay, and I know a lot of people are like, oh, this is so troublesome. But it's necessary work, right? Like we have to consider, like, are you actively investing in capitalism through your sermons, through your whatever, through your culture at your church, right? Like, are you actively investing in this kind of the erasure of other ways of life, right? And I think that like this is really important for us to kind of step beyond, right? Because I feel like for me, I see white supremacy in the way that it is an inhibitor within the church, right? It actually hinders us from being able to be who God needs us to be, right? Because it limits who we're able to talk to, right? Or it requires us to put conditions on the people that can come in the door, right? And we see that that is actually counter to scripture, right? Like Jesus didn't right go and say, okay, I'm only going to go talk to the rich people, right? I am only going to go talk to the people that are actively working in the farms, right? No, he just was talking to whoever he came across and whoever came to him, right? And so we do see that included outcasts and misfits and all of the above, right? And so I think that we miss those people, right? And those people don't even want anything to do with the church or us because of the church's investments in the projects of white supremacy. And so whether it is on an interpersonal basis or as the church body, right, we do have to do the work of unpacking that.
And that was part of what the last thing you said there, as far as Jesus was not going to one specific type of people. He was spreading. I mean, he basically got an amphitheater on a mountain and talked to whoever would listen. And but the people that ended up coming to him, that were drawn to him, were those that were coming from places where they felt like other people did not see them as valuable. Mm-hmm. Whether it was because of how rich they were in the tax collector's case, whether it was how poor they were in the case of some of the others, whether it was because of a physical ailment, whether it was because of the shame of just having been divorced and married and divorced and married and divorced and married, or however, it is, they were drawn to him because of the fact that he saw them as he created them to be.
Right.
not as what society had put them into. And that is what we as the church have got to get back to doing, is recognizing people as the image bearers they are, rather than trying to put people into the images that the Eurocentric humanist society tells us that we are supposed to be looking at them as.
Right. And that's not to say that it's one or the other, right? It's like, we're not saying that you can't, right, support nuclear families, that you can't do all this stuff,
right,
but that it shouldn't be promoted as the only and the right way to do things.
And why are you doing it? Are you
Right.
doing it because you think that this is the benefit to you? Or do you actually think that it is benefit to these families and everything else? Are you doing it because you know that the more there are, the more people are going to vote like you? Or are you doing it in a way that is still going to be supportive of the single mother that's walking in the door?
Right.
How are we going about it? Why are we doing it? And you said earlier that the idea of doing this stuff and correcting this stuff is tedious, but it is the gospel work.
Right.
It is literally the work of the gospel to do this. And so just saying this is hard, we're back at John 6. A lot of people, after Jesus tells them what he's requiring of them, say, this teaching is hard, who can do this? And they go on their way.
Right.
So why are you doing this? Are you doing this because it's benefit to you? Or are you doing this because you're going to answer like the disciples and say, where else would we go? You hold the words of truth and life.
Yeah. And I think it's also important that like this kind of challenge, right, this call to interrogate investments in white supremacy across churches is not explicit. It's not exclusive to either like Christian nationalist churches or conservative churches or liberal churches. It is all of the above. And so like I also encourage like those who identify as progressive or liberal churches also to think about their investments in this, because even if you're actively going and serving in your local community, right, or you're donating or you're volunteering or whatever, if you are going in with the mentality, oh, I need to save these communities, I need to fix these communities, then that might be an indicator that you're still operating under the guise of white supremacy, right? Because there's an assumption that they are already not of value. And you need to make them have value, right? You need to make so that they live up to who they are.
and it just even the way that it's worded, you are calling yourself savior here. Mm-hmm. It's not that the gospel is going to be able to do this work here. It is that I'm going to be able to fix these problems.
Right.
Again, it's because of the fact that it is an idolatry issue at its core. And that's what we have to get rid of. I mean, and I would even add, this isn't even just exclusive to Western Christianity. This is Christianity as a whole has to actually take a step back and look at this, because we know that within places that experience colonization, this is still at the heart of some of their teaching if they are coming from certain traditions. Mm-hmm. The fundamentalist movement is very big within South America and Africa. The Reformation movement is very big within African countries. Our good friend Prudy over in India, after we did our episode with him back a couple years ago, he and I both got flooded with messages from other Christians in India saying, no, that's not how Christianity is in India, because look at us. And when you look at their website, it looks identical to the Baptist church down the road from me here. Yeah. And so the same arguments against why Prudy is saying the church should be speaking out against casteism in India are identical to the same arguments we hear from churches in our neighborhood saying, why are you not supporting such and such a candidate for president?
Yeah. And I'm glad that you brought that up, because that was going to be my other thing as like thinking through the differences between white supremacism and racism, is that racism is plural, right? Like it has plural manifestations. So that means that, right, that racism doesn't look the exact same in every single culture or every single society, but that doesn't mean that it's not racism, right? Because it is dependent on the social context, right? And so I think that a lot of times people will assume that if it doesn't look like racism in the United States, then it's not racism. And that's not true, right? Is that like you can go, especially as me, you know, I am an East Asianist. So I study race and identity in China and Korea and Japan. And a lot of times people will be like, oh, there's no racism there. They're all the same. And I'm like, okay, we can unpack the fact that that statement alone is already, right, is already problematic. But like,
I mean, how many years of wars do we have to look through history to know that that's not the case?
Right,
Like,
that's not the case at all,
I
right?
mean,
and racism looks different in each of those contexts, right? But that doesn't make it not racism. And the existence of a kind of diversity of experiences regarding racism doesn't actually, you know, eliminate or erase what a specific group is experiencing, right? Like if you leave here, right? And let's say like you go to China as an Asian American and you now get to benefit from being, you know, Chinese passing in a Chinese space, right? That doesn't erase the fact that you still, when you come to the United States or you go somewhere else, have to deal with anti-Chinese racism, right? And so I think that like people tend to, and this also, as we've talked about before, is a legacy of Enlightenment and humanist thinking, right? See the world in black and white. It's either this or that, right? But what we find with like these systems, right, is that they are often operating at the same time, right? Like racism and white supremacy are at the same time, right? Genocide and Orientalism operate at the same time, right? And their manifestations may be different, right, and complex, but that doesn't mean that we need to like dismiss people's claims, right, or dismiss what is happening just because it doesn't look like what we assume racism should look like or what we assume white supremacy should look like, because all of these systems are contingent. And even as they maintain a kind of similar ethos of like presumed superiority or hierarchical divisions of people based on their categorization in society, right? Even as they assume that sameness, their manifestation is different. And that's part of the reason why, circling back to our conversation about the past and history, right? People tend to put racism and all of that into the past is because they're looking at those specific manifestations and they're saying, because it doesn't happen like that anymore, racism doesn't happen, when that's not true.
Yeah, so we got to shut this one down. I'm sure you'll be back because we have plenty more to talk about. Even just on this topic alone, we have plenty more to talk about. But you can check out her with a lot of the other things she's doing, whether it's within the network stuff or even some of her writing, things like that. She's going to have a guest portal up here soon. You don't actually have a website up yet, correct?
Nope, I'm working on it.
Yes, she's working on it. You'll be able to find that once it's up and running. Again, you'll be able to catch her on some of the other shows, things like that we got going on. She shows up every once in a while for Kingdom on the Road, shows up every once in a while for Let It Rip, all those different stuff. And I'm sure, like you said, she will be back here as well in the future. So in the meantime, you can find her and all the other guests over on our website, ministrymisfits.com. If you go under the resource tab, you'll be able to find the guest tab and be able to go through all the guest portals there. If you want to support the show or join the Bible study we're doing, Walking Through Daniel, which deals with some of this stuff as well, you can do that, patreon.com/ministrymisfits, and get all of that. Any of the levels there get you access to the Bible study. We know we're a week or two behind. Schedules got chaotic for both me and Tamiko, but we are trying to get caught back up, and so everything will be up there soon. So, Tiara, thanks for coming in. Thanks for agreeing to have the discussion with me that nobody else would agree to. And we will see the rest of you all next week.
The Ministry Misfits podcast is a production of Ministry Misfit Media in association with Overwhelming Victory. Dr. Greg Linville and Andrew Fouts are our executive producers, and Brandon Simmons is associate producer. The Ministry Misfits theme song is written and produced by J.D. Laird and Laird Creative Agency. If you would like to get in touch with us, you can email us at ministrymisfitmedia@gmail.com or by following @ministrymisfit on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok. You can also visit our website at www.ministrymisfits.com or through bio.link/Ministry Misfits. If you would like to support Ministry Misfits, you can become a patron by going to patreon.com/Ministry Misfits.